All right, welcome back. Baker versus Carr. All right, so again, our context for this case is that the Republican ideal in the U.S. is manifested in the structure and operation of the legislative branch. So we have a second case about congressional representation. All right, so in this case, what happens here is that Tennessee residents allege that reapportionment didn't take into account population shifts. Therefore, one person's vote wasn't necessarily equal to another person's vote. It's important to point out that this is talking about reapportionment for their state House. So we're talking about state Congress here, and we're not talking about the U.S. Congress in Washington, D.C. We're talking about for the state of Tennessee. And so they reapportioned, and they had been reapportioning the same way for a long time, but it didn't take into account population shifts. It was done by county. And so one person's vote wasn't necessarily equal to another person's vote. So the question is actually an interesting one. It's, does the Supreme Court have jurisdiction in questions of legislative apportionment? So the question isn't actually, is the reapportionment allowed or not allowed? The question really is, can the Supreme Court even hear this case? Do they have jurisdiction in this matter, or is this a political issue? All right, so the Supreme Court holds here that apportionment claims are justiciable in federal court. So that word justiciable, that means that if something is justiciable, it can be decided by a court. So the Supreme Court in this case is saying that they are allowed to settle apportionment claims. So they are. So the question again was, is this a political question or is this a judicial question? And they decide here that the Supreme Court can in fact rule on these issues. All right, so now the impact is going to be that this led to the one person, one vote principle that we still hold today. And this increased democracy, allowing more people to vote, and voting rights of minorities. So now people are going to be more equally represented than they were previously. So the idea is that one person's vote should count about the same as another person's vote mathematically. So meaning that we wouldn't have districts of very unequal size. So we're going to get rid of malapportionment as a result of this decision. So you can't have a district that has 500 people and another has 500,000 people, because if they each go and vote, the person who's in the smaller district, their vote is worth much more than the person in the larger district. So this is going to lead to that principle. And what did they use to support this decision? They used the Equal Protection Clause. So under the Equal Protection Clause, the appellants, meaning the people who sued, had a right to challenge unequal apportionment. So the Equal Protection Clause here is used to uphold the one person, one vote principle. All right, from the majority opinion, it mentions the 1901 Tennessee state statute that decided how apportionment was going to go. It says it's arbitrary, capricious, offensive to the 14th Amendment, has an irrational disregard of apportionment practices according to their constitution or any reasonable standard, and therefore this affects a gross disproportionate representation to voting population. So essentially the way that they were doing it was just tremendously wrong and tremendously unequal, and since the court has decided that they are allowed to hear these types of cases, they are now going to rule that this was a very poorly done reapportionment, so that state is going to need to go back to the drawing board. They say, maybe more important for us, is that a person's right to vote free of arbitrary impairment is a right that has been judicially recognized from the Constitution. So it gives you examples of how a person's right to vote could be taken away from them, false counting of the votes, refusing to count votes, doing extra votes. That all these things would harm a person's ability to vote, and courts have been able to rule against those things in the past. And so they're saying that this is essentially similar. It's not happening on the day of election, but by making the districts unequal, it's having the exact same effect, so the court is allowed to rule in this case. The dissenting opinion, they have an interesting point. They say, hey, the appellants wanted to vote and have their votes counted, and those things happened. They voted and their votes got counted. They went to the polls, they cast their ballots. It says their complaint is simply that the representatives are not sufficiently numerous or powerful. So they're like, what's the problem? They got to vote, they got to send somebody to Congress, shut up. But that's their dissent. And then maybe the more powerful part of the dissent is showing that this is going to be a completely new precedent. And so they're pointing out this fact. Such a massive repudiation of the experience of our whole past. And they call this a destructively novel judicial power. So the judicial branch is doing something new and, in his opinion, destructive. Says that this disregards the inherent limits of the court's judicial power. And it says that this exemplifies the futility of judicial intervention in this essentially political conflict. So this dissent says we should not be able to hear this case. This is a political issue, and it should be up to the people and their representatives to settle it. It is not up to the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, to do it. This is a bad new precedent being set. And then it goes on again a little bit further. The court doesn't have purse nor sword, so they don't have power of budget, they don't have power of war. Their power ultimately rests on sustained public confidence in its moral sanction. So, how do we get that confidence from the public? Because again, remember, they can't enforce their own decisions. They rely on others to do that. It says that such feeling must be nourished by the court's complete detachment, in fact and appearance, from political entanglements, and by not injecting itself into the clash of political forces in political settlements. In other words, the Supreme Court doesn't have any real power on its own constitutionally. It doesn't have budget power, it doesn't have war power, it doesn't have things it can do. It only has power as long as it retains the confidence of the people, and it needs to keep itself completely free of politics in order to keep that confidence. All right, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that like button for me. This has been a LaMoney Production.